I'd just like to say a few words at the beginning. I scrolled down some notes about what I wanted to say at the beginning, and there's no way I'm going to remember them, so I'm just going to read them, if that's okay. So if it appears a little bit stilted, I apologise, but it's these guys who are to do the off-the-cuff improvisational stuff later on. But really, the idea about this is an interesting article I saw on the BBC News website last year, and here it is. Let's look at that. Should scientists stop giving advice? Now the context for this, it's about the 2009 L'Aquila earthquakes in Italy and the role of the seismologists in warning for those earthquakes. And obviously there was a lot of controversy there. But this is also a particularly important question for meteorologists. We've made huge strides in recent years in making ourselves as valuable as possible to our governments, to the public, and also in terms of our commercial proposition. But it is really vital that we set expectations correctly. As we embrace the idea of risk, that's the technical definition defined by both the likelihood and the impact of an event, we do need to ensure that our users understand these concepts and know how to act accordingly on our advice. Nations and businesses these days speak this language of risk, and when a nation looks to understand and mitigate its environmental risk, it often finds the problems and the solutions are complex, span disciplines, organisations, and even borders. And there are other complications. We make increasing use of probabilistic methods to express weather-related risk, yet we find that some only ever treat our forecast deterministically. Just look how quickly the statement, odds on for a barbecue summer, was interpreted as a promise of fine weather prior to the very wet British summer of 2009. There's increased appetite from our partners and customers for information on the merest hint of significant weather, yet there can also be a lack of acceptance of, for example, the inevitability of false alarms. Thinking big and acting early is becoming a common approach amongst emergency responders in high-risk situations. But at the same time, there are others in our meteorological community or in the media who may rely on overstating the risks of extreme events to grab headlines. So perhaps we can empathise with the earthquake scientists who look to communicate raised levels of risk without inciting panic. Either way, our organisations, both public and private, and both internally and in partnership across Europe, face a difficult balancing act in successfully communicating natural hazard risk while retaining the trust of our users. I'd like the panel this afternoon to explore these issues and the practical, ethical, or even legal consequences of taking a risk-based approach. So that's the opening question, if you like. So I think we'll spend a few minutes going around each of the panelists in turn and gathering their opening thoughts. I think to set the scene, we'll go over to Paul Davis first. Paul.
Good afternoon, everybody. The title of the panel session was Hazards, Advice and Risk, and how far should we go? And really, I think that came very pertinent during my time as Chief Forecaster of the summer floods of 2007. The forecast rainfall was spot on, 90 millimetres of rainfall in Gloucester. And the inquiries we had coming through to the operations centre from some of the response community were some confusion. I had one call that said 90 millimetres, I've got my ruler, put it on the floor, 90 millimetres, you're dealing with a big puddle. Now from a hydrological point of view, 90 millimetres falling in an area which is very sensitised to that amount of rain in terms of flood response is something which that local authority response community didn't really grasp. And to some degree as a chief forecaster, there was a bit of frustration. And through working really closely with our environmental agency colleagues, such as Crane, we worked out what do we mean by 90 millimetres of rain? What is the impacts of that rainfall? And how do we communicate that to the response agencies, to the public, to those who really need that information so they can take appropriate action? And that really is the thrust really of why we set up the Flood Forecast Centre. And that was a Met Office and Environment Agency initiative supported by government. And that has been established since 2009 with some huge successes. And the success really is around people as much as the science and technology. And the people, and what I mean by that, is that by having two disciplines working together, we really began to untap and unlock the potential that both agencies had perhaps more so than we ever thought we did when we worked, in some senses, separately before the summer floods of 2007. And it also galvanised increased trust and authority to the public and emergency response community. And again, I cite the Cumbria floods in 2009, where through the establishment of the FFC, we were able to give longer lead time advice to authorities in Cumbria. And I think largely because of the earlier mitigation action, that was in part thanks to the FFC and the harmonisation and the working of the Environment Agency and the Met Office, and both consistently and agreeing the message to that community was, in some senses, the success of that warning and advice. And then the message is, why stop at flooding? Why can't we explore other hazards such as volcanoes, such as tsunamis, such as space weather? Where do we stop? Where does meteorology go and explore on other hazards? And so the message here in the panel is, hazards, how far should we go? Well, the Met Office is already in the process of delivering operational service of space weather and working with partnerships across the United States and colleagues in Europe and globally. So in that sense, the standard meteorological information of rainfall and showers is perhaps not so appropriate with space weather. It's a whole new discipline. So how far do we go? We're already moving away from the pure meteorological foundation there. And partnerships. Partnerships is not an easy option. It's not an easy option because what it requires is honesty and openness. It requires soft skills that actually are quite hard to do. It also requires a certain amount of resolve and courage. And what I mean by that is to stick your neck out and to be openly opportunity, bring that partnership and collaboration together requires a little bit of guts. But the benefits of it is huge. The benefits of genuine recognition of each other's perspective, the unexpected results that come out of partnerships that perhaps you wouldn't have thought of when you first ventured into partnership working, the recognition of the bigger picture, and I think the importance as well, the increased importance of partnership working as you go forward. So really, in that sense, I think in terms of how far do we go with advice and hazards and risk, I think that's largely based on foundation of partnerships, collaboration, sharing the concerns and issues and opportunities with partner agencies, and then working with the public and emergency response community and the government, finding the best means of mitigating against natural hazard impacts, which obviously is increasing exponentially globally. So in that sense, I think my message of how far should we go is should be a shared collective view with our partner agencies and the public. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. We'll come back to the UK view, if you like, in a minute with Craig, but I want to go further afield first and go next to Gerald. Gerald.
Not so far afield, just across the Irish Sea. I'll give a little different perspective perhaps on the question of how far should we go, coming from my own experience, because I've been a meteorologist for over 30 years, but I've been a weather broadcaster for most of that time. And when somebody goes on television, particularly on television, on radio also, but particularly on television where the visual element is there, of course, and you're recognised and recognisable, and you give a forecast, and more particularly you give a warning, you become very much the face of that information. And the credibility which the public invest in that information is about their credibility about you as a person. And if you've been an experienced person who's been there for many years and they've grown to know you, hopefully to like you, hopefully to believe you now and again, then all that will form part of the background to the way they listen to you and the way they take your words seriously. And that's a huge responsibility. It's a huge responsibility to place on the shoulders of one person. So we have this great structure of meteorology, operational meteorology, from observations through NWP, through forecast offices, private or public, it doesn't really matter. And you have an end message in the context of talking to the public. Paul was talking very much about dealing with partner agencies, and I'll come back to that in a moment too. But I'm talking to the public, and it becomes personified in that one broadcaster who is delivering the message. So first of all, I would sort of make statement or plea that broadcaster would be better well supported by that structure, because in a sense they're taking a huge amount of responsibility on themselves, and it's a responsibility you don't lose when you walk out the door. You don't finish work when you walk out the door, because of course you're a well-known person and that responsibility attaches to you. So that's maybe one perspective that I would have on this question of how far should you go. It is an increasingly important question in weather broadcasting when we come to deliver weather information, and particularly severe weather information, as to what extent should we focus on the impacts, potential impacts of be it a windstorm or heavy rain incidents which could lead to flooding. And in many cases, in Western Europe particularly, the meteorological agencies are not the hydrological agencies, and there's that separation, and you may not have the flooding consequences well understood within your own organisation. Thunderstorms, whatever. That's a real issue for weather broadcasters, to what extent you just deal with the weather, or to what extent you actually try to look beyond that. Because as a broadcaster, as any broadcaster, you're trying to reach your audience, you're thinking of what your audience are interested in. If you're talking about heavy rain and you know that there's farmers trying to save a harvest or something like that, and that it's a critical time of the year, then that's in your mind. So you're focusing your message to some extent on those people who you think will be particularly critically affected. So that's an element of you trying to estimate in your own mind how far down that road of translating weather information to impacts one might possibly go. And it's a question to which there is no easy or consistent answer. Now, coming to consistency, and this is just a practical thing with weather warnings, across Europe in the last decade or so, a little more, we have developed the Meteor project, which has attempted to bring consistency to the presentation and understanding of weather warnings across borders within Europe, recognizing that many people travel, recognizing that we have many language differences, and that somebody from Poland who's visiting France may be just as entitled to get a warning, shall we say, without necessarily having to understand the French language. So there is what appears a very, very simple interface now on the Meteor website, where all the Met services contribute warnings, and they're all presented there with a kind of a traffic light type of representation, and easily understood. But those of us who've been inside the system know that behind that apparent simplicity there's a huge amount of complexity, trying to have thresholds which are sensible from one country to another, trying to marry impact-based warnings with threshold-based warnings, because different countries have different approaches, trying to have consistency across borders, across regions. These are real questions, real challenges that we still haven't fully overcome in trying to present a consistent and coherent approach to weather warnings, if you like, across this continent of ours. If we look at, and Paul mentioned the other areas to where, in a sense, we're beginning to go now with hydrology, with volcanology, geology, I suppose, space weather, and so on. In many ways, we're a much, much more mature professional community than those professional communities when it comes to thinking of these things. And that's because the nature of our work has forced us to go out and talk to the public and present information to the public, and has been doing so for half a century or more. So when we talk to others from that community, we realize that our understanding of how a message might be formulated or presented, and our knowledge of the media even, and how best to use them and work with them, is generally far, far more developed than that of those from, if you like, the other geophysical professions. And that, to an extent, puts us potentially in a role where we need to be leaders. And we have a lot of that ability within our community, we have a lot of that experience, and that suggests that we should use that to lead these other communities, hydrological communities, geophysical communities, who are now, if you like, being pushed into the limelight when it comes to geophysical hazards. I would suggest, in the unfortunate case of these seismologists in Italy, that if they had been weather broadcasters, they certainly wouldn't have ended up in jail. And the reason is that those who, listening to the case, the judges, whatever, I'm not sure of the legal situation in Italy in terms of the structure, but they would have become used to these people appearing nightly, whatever, on television or radio. They would have understood that whereas they give a forecast every day, that some days it's right and some days it's wrong, hopefully more days it's right than it's wrong, but that there's a certain inherent uncertainty, and people accept that fact and have accepted it for decades, even though we struggle sometimes to put numbers on our uncertainties from our point of view. But people appreciate that weather is not certain. A forecast is a statement of something that we think will happen tomorrow, and sometimes it doesn't. Whereas in their particular case, because in a sense it was a one-off event and people had no benchmark to measure their warnings against, if earthquakes were a daily occurrence and people were receiving daily earthquake updates, then they would have had, but that's not the situation. So they were caught in a very unfortunate, almost one-off situation where their warning was insufficient, unfortunately, to warn people, enough to actually take preventative action. So in a sense, I'm just trying to make the point that we are, in our community, we are blessed by being relatively mature in terms of our relationship with the media, with the public, and also the nature of our daily interaction puts us in a different space. The other thing I think that's very interesting when it comes to warnings of severe weather is to what extent we graduate the release of the information that we have at our disposal. I mean, with extreme forecast indices and other tools now, with the improvement of deterministic forecasting up to the point where 6-7 days ahead, we can have sometimes a very, very good idea, supported perhaps by good probabilities from the ensemble systems. Do we want to tell people today, Wednesday, that on Monday next there'll be something serious? We issue a warning to people because, or to bodies or to organizations, because we want them to take action. So the question of when we issue the warning should be tied into when do they need to take the action. So it may be quite reasonable to issue a warning to a local authority or an agency which has to take preventative action. Let's say we are fairly certain that there'll be floods next Monday. Would the local authority or the environment agency, whoever it is that's responsible for dealing with the impact of flooding, may want to have 5 or 6 days notice so that they can mobilise crews to do this, do that or the other, work which will help to mitigate the impact. But it may not be sensible to tell the public at this stage. It may be sensible to tell them in 2 days' time or 3 days' time. That's a very difficult area to try and make judgments in, and in some ways it's an ethical area. You're making assumptions not just about your science, but about how people will react to the message you have to give, and you're thinking about timescales and actions and so on. And those are questions to which there aren't really any easy answers. So how far should we go? Possibly further than we've gone historically, but there are limits.
Thank you very much, Gerald. And obviously, we're not just talking about National Met Services here. The private sector has a role to play in all of this. And Dennis.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, for the private sector, I think the focal point of our activities is always the client. So what do they demand, and what is their problem? And I think our main purpose of our existence is to help them to make decisions, whether it's about natural hazards or risks for their business, or also opportunities on which they want to take advice. And I think that should be true not just for the private sector, but also for the public sector, to look at who is receiving the information and what is the impact of the activities. In order to shape that information in a good way, and to optimize the action which is taken, I think it's very important that we create I would call overlap of knowledge, so that we as meteorologists understand what the constraints and the problems of our clients or the audience are, and likewise the client understands what the constraints of meteorological information, of forecasts, and of what we can deliver are. And only if we create this mutual understanding, I think we can achieve the highest impact of our advice and meteorology. So the ECAM is a good place to do that, to involve the user as well. The other thing is, how far should we go? I always think that, well, from a commercial side, I think it's better if a client pays us, a meteorology, to take the advice as if they pay professional consultants, which just translate our advice into their language. So I think it's not. I think we can gain more when we think about the problems and the challenges of our clients, and not just retreat into our meteorological domain. From a private sector perspective, there are a lot of sectors which we address. Utilities and insurances. They are certainly aware of how to deal with risk and probabilities, but also the transport sector, airports, road and rail, and also governmental organizations. And when I look at the road service, they have problems to deal with probabilities, because in the end they have to make a decision: do I go out spreading salt or do I stay at home? And I see many instances where the responsibility or the decision is kind of passed on to the meteorologist to translate the probabilities in a decision to them when they should go out and do their work. I think there's no real way around that if a client demands it, but we should also make sure that we also mention the uncertainties. But again, from a commercial perspective, we do not take on a lot of liabilities for our advice. But from experience, I can also say that just let's say that overwarning and trying to gain publicity by making the event larger than it is also doesn't pay off. And I don't see that happening a lot of times by meteorologists, but more often by journalists who pick up the information and from an occasional 90 millimeters of rain, they translate it in a countrywide 90 millimeters of rain, and have a completely different story than what we want to tell as meteorologists. Well, maybe come to a kind of controversial point, I don't know. I think we should treat the users of the information as mature individuals who are entitled to make their own decisions which provider and service they think best fits to them. So whether they are in government or in private institutions, I think they have enough knowledge to make a decision who should be their partner, and I don't think there's a natural link from government to government or from private sector to private companies, but that should be the decision of the user himself, because in the end he has the responsibility to defend his decision. And last but not least, there is also the approach of having a single voice, and I think that it certainly can make sense to try to align the communication we do to the public in really extreme situations. But in general, I would say we should approach the best voice and not try to enforce a single voice. So when I look at Jared's example, of meteor alarm and the challenges to align the national Met services. I think it's a good opportunity for private sector companies working cross-border and doing it much better. Thank you.
More on that later, I'm sure. Fred.
Thank you, Will, and good afternoon, everyone. I guess fundamental to my thinking is my experience over the last 15 years working on how best to communicate with the public and the professional partners, the emergency services who have to respond to flood events. I'd like to start, since we're at a science conference, with some statistics. And every year we talk to our customers and find out what they're thinking about our services and what they'd like for the future. And this is the answers to 3 key questions, and you may see a bit of a challenge in the answers to these questions for us. 90% of the people we talk to about our flood warnings, which depend very much on the forecasting services from the Met Office, 90% of our customers say they understand what we're talking about. They think they're really clearly expressed. 67% of those customers think we provide accurate and effective warnings. 50% of our customers do anything about those accurate, well understood warnings. So as a scientist or an engineer, I can't understand the logic of someone who thinks a warning is well communicated, accurate, but then does nothing about it. What is it that's getting in the way of that forecast achieving an action which is beneficial to that individual, that company, that organisation? What is it we're maybe not doing which needs to go alongside that ability to communicate? Because it's not just what you say, and I agree with Gerald, well-respected individuals can make a real impact with the way they communicate and what they say. And I think at times you need to not just operate with one voice, but you need to use the best voice. But it's not just about what you say, however much you try hard to get it right. You need to understand who you're talking to and what their motivations are and what their understanding is of the situation they're facing. And for flooding, a lot of people want to deny that their flood risk exists. They do not want to think about flood risk and the impacts it may have on them, their family, their business, their home. They do not want to engage with that, like they don't want to engage with many risks. So unless we're able to do something about moving people's perceptions of risk forward, we're not going to be able to make a breakthrough on the communication. So we need to engage with people over what they can do, what they understand, and that requires different techniques and involvement. So it's not just about what we say, there has to be something else alongside it. And I guess my experience, over the last 15 years working through different floods is that we've slowly but surely moved along that journey. But 15 years on from the Easter 1998 floods in central England, we're only still on that journey. We've improved our ability to forecast, to work together, and after the 2007 floods, which Paul mentioned, there was a government review undertaken in the UK, and Sir Michael Pitt, who undertook that review, gave a really key message to the public services, and that was to put people at the centre of what you do. Think about what you do meaning something for every individual you're engaged with. And I think if you work from that perspective, as Dennis was saying, from a customer perspective, you can begin to build up the techniques you need to apply to get the right action undertaken at the end of the day by that individual. And our experience is that individuals who do accept the risk, do listen and do something themselves during the flood, are emotionally better off afterwards than those who don't, physically better off health-wise, and they've engaged as part of a community in responding to helping themselves. And all of those positives do come out of a flood event when we go back and talk to people, compared to those who don't get involved in that risk. So there is a real benefit at an individual level, as well as an emergency responder level of engaging with flood risk. There was mention of making information available. Do we make all our ensembles available to every member of the public whenever they want them? Well, when the UK Prime Minister David Cameron went down to Cornwall after the 2010 floods there, not really big floods, just some communities badly hit, he came back recognising that the joint work between the Environment Agency and the Met Office was doing some really good forecasting work on future risk, but he was dismayed to find that we weren't sharing that information openly with the public and pushing it out in the way he thought we should be doing. And his challenge to us was to, if you know about it, you share it. Take the view that whoever you're talking to has the ability to understand, absorb and do something with that information. It's their responsibility. I think that's partially true, but I think if we don't work on those individuals, those communities, those groups who need to understand in a way which makes it effective for them, if we're not doing that as well as communicating, we're only doing half the challenge. So I think our challenge is not just about being great communicators, it's about preparing people to hear the message and do something about it. Thanks, Will.